Jen. And I'm Sawyer. And you're listening to Our House, A to Z.
All right, welcome back to Our House, A to Z.
How's your social media fast going?
My social media fast, it's not really fair. I mean, I've talked to a couple of people who don't have social media, and they, like me, are just kind of like, yeah, this is like kind of like a normal season.
So did you choose something else to fast in this season while everybody else was fasting?
No.
Social media?
No, not really. I kind of live a lifestyle of fasting things that I don't need.
Oh, really? Like what?
Like social media.
It's just a lifestyle for you?
Story of my life. Yeah, pretty much.
The story of my life.
Well, I've heard good reviews.
Okay. I have
good
too.
reviews.
What have you heard?
Good reviews.
Like
just,
what?
Just that people are recognizing like that it's good for them. Like it feels good. It's clearing up a lot of time. Like I'm getting more done,
Amen.
which is true, and all of that is good.
I love that.
I'm not going to lie. There's sometimes I'm like, man, I feel like I'm missing stuff. I hate that.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if by the end of this, I'm wondering how many people are going to be like, you know what? I really was like losing sleep at night. I really was like wasting time. I really was more anxious.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've literally, after 1 week, we've literally heard from people that they're not as anxious. 1 week.
Yep.
That's remarkable.
I know.
Now, the like crazy thing will be, will you go back to it?
What I'm hoping is that, especially for parents, they're realizing what it does to you internally. Just think about that with your kids who are not like fully developed and their brains aren't fully developed and what they're processing.
Yeah.
You hear all the time, kids are resilient. And it's like, kids are resilient in a lot of ways, like we discussed on here last week. But
you shouldn't want them to have to be.
You shouldn't want them to have to be. And adults should be resilient to all of the social media garbage because you already know better.
Right.
But it still affects you.
Yep.
And so how much more so with kids that are like all hormonal and going through all sorts of
self-image stuff and everything else.
All of that. Like they just can't. They can't process it correctly. It's like even the best kids who love the Lord and are passionate about the Lord, it's just a bad idea. But here's something I know we had another topic today, but maybe we'll hold it off till next week. One thing I kind of wanted to talk about today was we've talked about boundaries with marriage. You know, we've done hedges conversations and why you and I have like a lot of boundaries on what we do and who we drive with and why we don't do texting with people of like the opposite sex, all that kind of stuff. And I think for parents, you know, we had that Parenting Next Gen conversation last weekend with Michael Marshall when he was in town, and there was a lot of great information shared at that. And I think it was a really good reminder to me as a parent to recheck some boundaries that I have with my own kids.
Okay. Like when you say boundaries you have with your own kids, you mean like protection mechanisms for them?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
So protection mechanisms. And then in addition to that, having a discussion on here with you about how in wisdom do we let out lying to our kids at certain ages. Because I think that is a huge challenge. You know, you hear so many conversations about, well, kids are all different and you know your kids and this one's different than that one and this one's different than that one. Some are more responsible than others. Some are willing to take more risks than others. And all of that is true. But can we just set some like standard boundaries or standard, you know, like protections up for our kids? But then at the same time, we've seen the opposite effect where it's like we have such strict boundaries. I'm going to protect my kid. I'm going to bubble them.
Rebel as soon as they get the opportunity.
As soon as their freedom, because they've never been taught how to use it well.
Yeah.
How to steward freedom. And that is not just on a cell phone. That is with a car. That's on phones at all. That's out in public. That's tattoos. Like all these things, because we have all of a sudden, like now I got to do all these things because what has happened is I've been held back from everything for so long.
Of course.
And it's one of those things where there's like a pit on both sides of the road.
Yep.
So how as parents do you like navigate that well and letting out the right amount of line for each age as they grow up to say, hey, I trust you until I've lost that. You know what I mean? Until you've like, I don't want to say messed up because there's grace for messing up, but still.
Yeah. And I think some of it is, it's like the risk of, and I almost hate this conversation because I feel like the vast majority of parents need to hear more about putting the boundaries in place than they do like being too protective. Well, I think
I get that. I can see that.
We've seen and dealt with like some extreme cases of hyper protective, hyper conservative, the purity culture stuff that keeps coming up on here. We've heard some of the worst cases, but they're like a fringe. It's like a margin of people that are making those mistakes versus the ones that don't put anything in place. And the reason why we hear more about those mistakes, the small fraction, is because the other side is so normalized. It's so culturally normal for every kid to have 3 or 4 social media accounts, all different devices, no restrictions, no time limits. You know what I'm saying? So I think the ones that are super sheltered, those are the cases that make it to us, you know, being pastors of a conservative church and things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas the vast majority of families are just like totally unaware. One thing that we talked about with Micah and Bethany that'll be on an episode coming up down the road is like, no, your kid doesn't have privacy.
Yeah.
Like the idea of like, oh, it's my kid's private time. It's like their privacy. I don't want to invade their space. I don't want to go through their phone. And it's like, no, just things like that are.
Yeah. And I get that your kid doesn't have privacy. However, I do think when your kid is 16, 17, 18, I don't think you need to be snooping through their journal and reading their journals and all of that. So I don't want to say they have no privacy.
Yeah,
like,
but I'd say a journal is different than a phone because a phone is communicating with
That's
other
what I'm
people.
clarifying.
Yeah.
That as your kids get older, they should have levels of more independence. And I think more independence every year, even from when they're like young, like 2-3 years old, you give them a little bit of space in order for them to figure out how to conduct themselves without you saying, this is exactly what you need to do. You're doing this wrong. You're doing this right. They have to have space to make mistakes.
Would you say it's better for them to learn something the hard way, but have had the freedom to make the mistake? Or is it better that you prevent them from making the mistake at all?
Oh, I don't want to answer that. That's the hard way. I mean, learning something the hard way, you could fall off a bike and learn the hard way, or you could like get somebody pregnant and learn the hard way. Those are two very different.
But the
very different things.
The philosophy is the same. Like I could make sure that my kid is on training wheels and then slowly like be so careful and so cautious that like I do everything in my power to make sure they never fall off a bike.
Right.
They could still, when they're 30 years old, be riding a bike and fall off of it. But for as long as they're under our care, is it? I know, because I know some parents that are like, yeah, my kid's probably going to do drugs. Like they're probably going to do drugs. They're probably going to try drugs. We just have to like show them, like Christian parents, and we just have to show them a more excellent way so that they don't go down that road.
Or there's just some parents that like buy alcohol because they're like, well, I know they're going to drink, so if I buy it and have the parties at my house, then it's like, okay.
Yeah, or I'm going to buy them condoms or, you know, contraceptives or whatever,
right.
Birth control to make
safe.
sure that like, you know, you don't end up with any long-term consequences, as if just having sex before marriage doesn't have long-term consequences.
Right.
And I think those are the kinds of things that we've got to think bigger than just like trying to prevent the immediate problem. I think if we're playing the long game, you know, we're going to be thinking more about the bigger picture.
I agree. I was thinking about it when it came to phones because, you know, we know a lot of people that are just kind of like no phones, no phones, no phones. And I totally understand that. I respect that. Like, hey, that's what your family's decided. I think it's great. However, when your child turns 18 and is no longer a child, they immediately are going to go get a cell phone.
Right.
And now this cell phone has no restrictions, no boundaries, and it is completely like this new open world to them that there's nobody over their shoulder saying, don't do this. Hey, let's start by doing this. Hey, let's introduce this app one at a time, or all that kind of stuff. And I think one of the downfalls of overprotecting our kids, and we see it often in Christian parenting, is that overreach protective, and it unintentionally causes our kids to like step into way too much as soon as there's any level of freedom.
Absolutely.
And the phone thing has been a thing for us. Like, hey, how do we decide what age? What's the right age? Okay. Micah had said, when they're able to stay home by themselves. I understand that. I disagree with it, but I understand it because I have a 10-year-old that can stay home by herself. she's not ready to have the responsibility of a phone. She's not going to charge it. She's not going to know what to do with it. It's just, she's too young.
So what would you say for her? So would you say...
I think you should have a phone that you leave
but
at home with your kid by themselves, of
What's
course.
the difference between that and an iPad? Like if they're communicating with their friends the whole time on it.
I don't think they're communicating with their friends the whole time on it.
But
And you
it's
can
the same-
restrict that.
But you can restrict a phone.
Yeah, I know.
It's the same access to all the same stuff
I know, but
unless
for
you
me,
restrict it.
No, for me, it's just kind of like the habit. So part of why we've pushed kind of getting phones back is the habit of it. Of like, hey, every time I feel a buzz in my pocket, I have to take my phone out and check it. I got to keep checking my phone, check my phone, even if it's a game. Anytime I'm bored for a second, I pull that out and I'm going to play the game on it. Mm-hmm. So could you get your kid a phone and then put tons and tons of restrictions on it? Yes, so they can't play any games and they can't, like the only thing they can do is call you. Yes, you can do that. Absolutely.
Right.
But I think just a broad statement of like, your kid should have a phone at 9 or 10 means something different to everybody.
But again, it's like you can't just say a phone because you can do anything on almost any device now. So it's like you can't say we are going to have this hard stand about no phone, but then there's like all access on an iPad.
Of course. I mean,
Yeah, so-
I think we're just talking about phones in particular right now. But yes, you're right. That's true. Tablets have
it's
all
like,
sorts
it's
of
like,
things.
Yeah, because I think people get hung up on the phone. We're like, we're not buying our kid a phone. No phone. Like you're too young for a phone. But it's like all the same problems are present. Just they don't have a phone, but they're figuring out a way to do it.
I mean, a lot of people who don't have phones don't do iPads and tablets either.
Yeah, I mean, I just see really little kids on tablets all day, just like teenagers are on phones, like nonstop, 24/7.
Right.
So the problem
I'm
is
not
the
talking
problem.
about screen. I'm not necessarily talking about like screen time right now. It's
Well,
more
no,
just
but I
like
think your point
it's
of-
more freedom space where it's like you can get yourself in trouble.
Yeah.
Screen time and playing too many video games. Yes, there's always that. It's more of like social media where how are we teaching our kids to use things responsibly? At what age can they go
So-
out by themselves? Can they take a car? Are they ever allowed to? I don't know. Like everybody has to determine that for themselves. But I think as a parent, sit down with your spouse and talk about what new freedoms you give your kid every year.
Yeah.
And that comes with more responsibility. So that's not just freedom that they get. Every freedom should come with a counterpart of responsibility that they have to take on.
Mm-hmm.
So, hey, now you do want a phone. You're 16 now and you're going to have a phone that has texting and I don't want to say a social media app yet. I'm not ready to say that at 16.
Yeah.
But like, here's the level of responsibility. Now you're paying for such and such a phone. And you're going to be doing these extra jobs that you're also going to have to do when you leave this house. You're going to have responsibilities.
Yeah.
And
I feel like you're talking about a couple different things, and it's hard to separate them because they all go along with maturity. But a kid who's responsible enough to have a job to pay for a phone does not mean that they're responsible enough to make good decisions with the phone. Mm-hmm. And I get it that they're like, oh, if you're going to have a car, you're going to have to like work and pay for the car. And that may help a kid take better care of the car and be more grateful of the car, which solves one problem. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that they won't be hooking up with their boyfriend in the back of the car.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as ironic as it is, a lot of times the maturity thing, it goes with making big kid mistakes. I mean, I can think in my own family of one individual who was super mature, super good work ethic, worked really hard, but a lot of the maturity was also played out in the bad side in like was doing way more adult things in relationships at the same time. So I think that it's two different things. If you're trusting them to like, okay, you're not going to have this until you can pay the monthly bill for it. I like that because it teaches work ethic in a world where we need to be teaching work ethic and responsibility and ownership and taking care of stuff. But the other side of the hedges thing is like, you know, to me, that may be a more important thing to deal with, which is like, just because you can work and afford a car.
About. It's definitely what I was talking about. I'm just saying with each level, like every year they have more responsibility in what they're responsible for, but then at the same time they are getting more freedom. It's not saying it's the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the same thing where they're having freedom and more responsibility. It's just as they grow older, it's two different sides. It's two different things. Every age your kid gets older, they should have more responsibility because they're going to be an adult. And every year your kid gets older, they should have little bits of more freedom because you have to learn how to steward freedom in a safe place.
Yeah. So what would you say are some like, I don't know if red flags is what I would say the word is, but what are some like warning signs that you would say, okay, I need to reel the line back in? Because we kind of started the conversation by saying, how do you know how much line to let out? I think you have some people that err on the cautious side. Then you have some people who are going to do the polar opposite of how they were raised. So if they were raised really protected, then they're going to be way more free.
Yeah.
If they were raised really free, then they're going to be helicopter parent. We do all these things. But what are some like things to look for, like real life things to look for, where maybe a place you or I have reeled back in because we're like, I'm not sure if you're ready for that yet?
I think we have with phones. Mm-hmm. I mean, and we've shared this on here before. We got the older boys, they're both teenagers. We've got them both Gab phones. Mm-hmm. It's kind of just like a restricted phone. It can text, it can call. There's no apps. There's no like social media apps on it. There's no internet on it.
And there's like if something inappropriate has ever been like texted,
anything like that, it alerts your phone.
Right.
You have a lot more like oversight
Right.
of a phone, of that particular type of phone. It's not the cool phone, which we know. We've heard many times. We know it's not the cool phone, but that's okay. So there have been seasons where we've pulled back on the phones. Like, hey, you know what? You're on it too much. I don't love the conversation happening. It's nothing bad, but just too emotional.
It's not good for you.
It's just not good for you.
Yeah.
I can see you getting like a little wound up in it. Every time it vibrates, you feel like that. It's like you got to respond right that second.
Yeah.
Nope, we're not. The phone doesn't control you. When I had a sense that, hey, this is just a little bit too much, we were like, you know what? We're going to do the summer with no phone because
why? Yeah.
It's all right. Like snap back to reality for a while. And then in a couple months, we'll reintroduce it and see, like have the conversations about why.
Right. I think part of this is like knowing your kids really well. And everybody relates differently to their kids. I know you have some parents who are like really good at doing the best friend thing. Sometimes I wish I was that. Sometimes I wish I could just have more like down to earth, like friendly conversations with the kids. But I also, I like.
You don't think you have friendly conversations?
Well,
what kind of conversations do you have?
Friendish, it's just not. We're not supposed to be peers with our kids. We're not supposed to be, we're not really supposed to be friends. We're supposed to be parents, and it just carries something different. But you see it, and you like. Sometimes I'm a little envious of parents whose kids talk to them more about whatever it is. But at the same time, I feel like if you know your kids, if you know their personalities, if you know their dispositions, if you know their countenance, if you know their patterns, then you can watch for changes. And I think that that's something that, and obviously during like puberty and hormones and all that stuff, like everything's changing anyway.
Yeah. But
I think you got to be so careful. And I've heard from parents, I've heard stories of like something happening in somebody's life, a kid's life, a teenager's life, and it's something they'll never talk about, but there are signs.
Yeah.
There are things changing in their countenance, their attitude, or their whatever.
Yeah.
And somebody that maybe once was like really social and bubbly is like now more reclusive and whatever, isolated or whatever. And so I just think that knowing these things, like how they're talking, how they're dressing, how they're acting, how they're interacting. Just be super sensitive to that stuff.
Right. Know their friends. So when you grab that phone and you're like, hey, who are you texting?
Right.
You know who it is.
Know their friends.
Not
That
just
is
be like,
huge.
who's this? Who's this? Like that shouldn't be happening.
Right. Yep.
Okay, 17 and 18 and they're like in a bigger school and you don't know every single person yet. Okay, there's space. You got to give grace in
You
some
just
of
come
these
to
cases.
Kings, and then you'll know all the kids.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's the involvement piece. I don't know what else I want to say about it. Just feeling that this week. Just feeling the need to say it's okay. It's okay to let some line out to your kids as they get a little bit older in a protected, safe space. It's the best thing for them.
Yeah.
To allow them to grow in a safe space and test things and try things in a safe space. Have space with guardrails.
But you're not saying
instead of
that
just held
you're-
right next to you.
You're not saying that like, hey, have condoms in the bathroom drawer for your kids. Well, I'm just saying, when you're just saying vague things, like that's how the world interprets it. It's the exact thing. It's like we have the alcohol cabinet and we have their friends can come over, and it's all done in a controlled environment.
Oh my gosh. That's not what I'm saying. Just to clarify.
Nobody's drinking and driving.
Not encouraging teen drinking.
But I do think, though, that that's the world. That's the world. And so for people who are totally ignorant and, It's pretty crass, I guess.
Yeah.
But for that level of where you're at, where you're thinking, you can have a kid that doesn't struggle with substance abuse. You can have a kid that doesn't
Totally. Or ever try it.
That does
You
that,
can.
or ever try it.
I'm trying to think of stuff that kids want to try or have or do in like high school, where it's like, I want to wear this new kind of makeup, or I want to get a tattoo, or like, how do you have those discussions? I think there's power in having conversations with your kids about like, hey, let's talk about like what a tattoo means. Instead of being like, not one person in this house is getting a tattoo while they live under this roof, not in my house. I think that does a disservice, because all I feel like I've seen from that is the exact opposite, where it's like, oh,
As
I
soon
can't
as
get a tattoo. Like, I know, like, anywhere, for some kids' personalities, it's anywhere where there's really strong, no, like, this is never happening. You're never doing this.
Yeah, you're going to push back.
You're going to push back and say, well, the second I get out of this house,
Yeah.
I am getting a tattoo.
Or maybe I'll get out of this house early.
Yeah, any of it.
Yeah,
I know it's
like
so stupid, like the tattoo thing, but we've seen it with hair coloring and makeup. And it's like, my kids are never going to be allowed to make up. The girls are never going to make it. It's it's like terrible and blah, 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 blah. Like,
Yeah.
we're not going to have harlots walking around this house, all this stuff. I get it. Do you expect your kid to never wear makeup in their entire life? Because if you think that your daughter at some point is going to wear makeup, allow a little something.
Yeah, and like
Say-
coach it.
And coach it. You have a chance now to be like, know how this looks actually really good on you.
Yeah.
When you do it this way. Know
Right.
what colors work well with your skin tone, these colors, instead of a hard no. And I don't know. I just feel like there's ways to have conversations about hard things that, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Pray for wisdom and
Yeah.
ask for counsel. You know, I think take it slow.
Yeah.
I feel like one pitfall that is easy, to find yourself in is to become obsessive about your kids not making the same mistakes you made.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you get fixated on that mistake.
Right.
And you end up not really paying too much attention to all the little mistakes that lead to that one or whatever.
Right.
That can become really dangerous too. And that's actually how history repeats itself, because you become so fixated on that it ends up being the thing that your kid needs to push against. And they end up making all the mistakes on the way there because you didn't really care that much about those. So then it just makes sense that the next mistake to make is the very one
know.
that you
I
worked
know.
so hard for them not to make.
Anyway, it's a lot to put in a podcast, and we got to
It
run
is.
because you're going to teach class. But
Okay.
thanks for stopping by, guys. We will see you next Friday on Our House.
This is Messer. And I'm Willa. This is our house from A to Z. Thanks for coming over.
Well, isn't that special?